So we're in chapter 19 of the United States History book, and section 4 goes over men in the White House. And we just finished going over President Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, and his assassination. When he was assassinated, his vice president would become president. His vice president was a man named Chester A. Arthur, and he was president 1881 after the assassination to 1885, the 21st president. They called him Chet. Always remember that, Chet Arthur, his name was. So he was the son of a Baptist minister and immigrant to Northern Ireland. He also was a lawyer in New York. The thing about Chet Arthur is that when he came into the White House, he basically wanted to renovate the whole White House and make it a showpiece, which he did. He dressed pretty extravagantly, way more than all the other presidents. You can see here. He actually had like 80 pairs of pants or something, and he also modernized the United States Navy. The Pendleton Act of 1883 was really important because that gave modern civil service, basically not on, modern civil service now is basically on qualifications. They have to be qualified to work in civil service in the government, politically. So this is really important. It's something that Garfield wanted to do, and Chet Arthur did. The stalwarts really, which he was a stalwart, they really didn't want this. So he did this despite what they said that he would do. So he actually did a lot of the civil service reform. He was a collector. He had been a collector at the Port of New York. So everybody thought, okay, has he been involved in the scandals at the Port of New York? In the midst of all that had happened there, in the midst, well, he became actually a pretty honest, president. Many thought he would side with the stalwarts, but he did not. He believed that federal jobs should be based on merit. So the biggest thing he did during this time was this Pendleton Act, which, of course, he knew Garfield would have done. So, a little bit more about him is that he also, people thought he was lazy because he would take a lot of naps, during the day, and they thought, oh, he's not really doing much, is he? But he ended up having a disease, I think it's Bright's disease, of his infections of his kidney. So he'd have kidney infections. And this led later on, 2 years later on, actually less than 2 years, I think, after he decided not to run for president again, he died of the disease. So during this time in the White House, he was pretty sickly. Also, right before he became president, his wife had died. And so his sister actually would help him, with any of the things in the White House and renovating the White House. So he ended up not running for president. So he really was never an elected president, so just as vice president. Now on to the next president, which become the 22nd and the 24th, two non-consecutive terms. President Grover Cleveland, 1885 to 1889. So it was the election of 1884 against Republican James C. Blaine. Here's a picture of James C. Blaine from Maine. Just think of Blaine from Maine. Good way, huh? So Blaine actually ran for president, and he had been involved as the Secretary of State, like under 2 presidents. He's a very popular politician, although he was thought to be involved in one of the conspiracies, under Grant. And so he had some issues that people dealt with him, like, was he involved? And he was also, I found that he was friends with Andrew Carnegie. And, I'm not really a big Carnegie lover, so I don't know whether he was involved at all. But anyway, he was the Republican. And so he had some strikes against him, but he running against Grover Cleveland, and the Republican Party was kind of divided. Grover Cleveland ended up becoming president. So, and he was president here 1837 to 1908. Oh, that's when he lived, not president. That's his age. I was gonna say, that's a long time. There we go. He was a Presbyterian, son of a minister. He also was a lawyer. We're talking about Grover Cleveland now. He was a lawyer, the sheriff of Erie County of New York. He'd also been the mayor of Buffalo, and then he ended up being the governor of New York. So Grover Cleveland, as well as before him, as Chet Arthur before him, they were both New Yorkers. So he's a New Yorker. He stood against the corruption of Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed, and all that, and this political machine too. So he was against corruption. Although he is not my favorite, as you know. I think you know that he's not my favorite president. So anyway, they say he became president because the mugwumps. What are mugwumps? Those are Republicans that decide not to be Republican anymore. And these mugwumps campaigned now for Cleveland. So he had some Republicans that were campaigning for him that went independent and campaigned for Grover Cleveland. That's how he's a Democrat. He's the first Democratic president since before Abraham Lincoln. So, and he'll be the first Democrat president up until like Woodrow Wilson maybe. But anyway, so he also had some things against him. In the past, he had brought up an illegitimate child and he was paying some child support. So this became a very big issue on his campaigns, although he still became president. Cleveland's first administration, they called him Grover the Good. Now, I don't think he was as good as thought. You have some things going on here, some cartoons. But anyway, he was the first Democrat before the Civil War. I already told you that. He was the only president that was married in the White House. And he was like 50-some years old, and he married a 21-year-old. Back in that time, I guess that was common. But they were 27 years age difference. But here you have a picture of their marriage. June 2nd, 1886, President Cleveland marries Frances Fulman. So he also vetoed many bills, which mean he was actually known for the top vetoer. Veto means that he rejected a lot of the bills of Congress. Even the pension bills for veterans, he rejected them. And he rejected a lot of civil service reform. He rejected for veterans, all of that. So he had more vetoes than any president up until that time, like twice as many as any president up to that time, all the presidents together, So a lot of vetoes. So he also, in 1886, he put forth the presidential succession action, so that was kind of important, and how the presidents would be. If something happened to a president, the vice president would become president, right? But what happened to the vice president? What happened to president, vice president? Both. So putting to that who would become president later on, and basically saying members of the cabinet, and then they went on to the Secretary of State. So that was during his time. And also he revised the Electoral Count Act to prevent another dispute like they had in 1876 with President Hayes, so they wouldn't have a problem again in that area. Here's some trivia about him. He was 5 foot 11 inches. He weighed 250 to 300 pounds. So he was the biggest president. And many say that he was the most unhealthy president of all the presidents. He smoked a lot of cigars, that's for sure. He was opposed to the temperance movement. He was a drinker, and so he was going to stop that temperance movement from alcohol, because he drank alcohol. He was the sixth cousin once removed of Ulysses S. Grant, so he voted more bills than the first 21 presidents combined. I already said that. So one other thing, we'll go back onto Grover Cleveland because we're going to go through that for his second administration. So he ran for president again, Grover Cleveland, but President Benjamin Harrison became president in 1889 to 1893, beating the electoral vote count for Grover Cleveland, Harrison being a Republican and Grover Cleveland being a Democrat. So Harrison, you see here, he has, it says in each state, Utah, death to polygamy, no more Cooley, and all these different things that he stood for here. Going on here, protection of American labor, all these things. President Benjamin Harrison was a dynamic Christian, so he was had a lot of integrity. Let's just say that. He was a senator of Indiana. He was the grandson of President William Henry Harrison, which was the 9th president. He was his grandson. Remember William Henry Harrison? He died. He was campaigning when he was campaigning, then he was giving his address, his inaugural address, and he was in the rain. He ended up getting pneumonia and dying, a few days, 30 days or so afterwards. So he never really got to be president very long. But this is his grandson. So President Benjamin Harrison, he stood up for tariff protection, meaning charging tariffs for foreign goods to come in. He would charge a protective tariff so that American businesses would be protected. So that was very important because Grover Cleveland did not. So Cleveland received a lot more popular votes, but Harrison received more electoral votes. So he actually got the presidency. Mrs. Cleveland, she was very upset. She wanted to stay in the White House. She said, "You guys take good care of my stuff, because I want to find it just in good condition because I'm going to be back in 4 years." And guess what? She was. So you can see here, we have President Benjamin Harrison taking over in the midst of the Democratic Party of Grover Cleveland. President Harrison's life. He was a successful lawyer. He was a Civil War hero. He was a general. In fact, he was the last of the generals. Up until now, all of them had been from General Grant. Up until this time, they were all generals, So he had fought in the Civil War as a Union general. He was a devout Christian. He was an elder in the Presbyterian Church for 40 years. He was a Sunday school teacher. In fact, even after he was president, he had devotions with others. Every morning, he would have his devotions, and he'd make sure that they weren't using any profane words, so he was very much a Christian and believed in Christian values. He had been a supporter clear back to the time of Lincoln. He was a supporter of John C. Fremont, even, who they were diehard, as for abolishing slavery. So he also was a supporter of President Garfield and Senator Blaine. In the midst, even though Senator Blaine got implicated in some of these conspiracies, which we don't know really if he was involved, Benjamin Harrison back at that time was very supportive and friends, especially of Garfield, and supporting Garfield. And he was very well known in the Senate and very well liked. Some historians feel he was not a very dynamic president and felt that his job of Congress was just to initiate measures of duty to carry them out. I disagree with that. I think he was a very dynamic president. Although America had peace then, and that time was very uneventful in many ways, it was a time probably that was blessed as the time of President Harrison being our president. He did not support the Chinese Exclusion Act that excludes Chinese immigrants from coming on. He thought that was very prejudiced, so he didn't support that, even though a lot of Republicans did. He during his time as president, he supported pensions for the veterans, and Cleveland was vetoing these veterans. Of course, veterans at that point needed money, needed pensions. Also, 6 new states were admitted. Six new states and Hawaii later that he admitted to the Union of the United States. That's a big deal right there. So they say, oh, his life in his presidency wasn't much. 6 new states were admitted to the Union, and he supported Hawaii coming in. He also stood for African American rights. Frederick Douglass was on his cabinet. Frederick Douglass, known for rights for the Black Americans. He also had a whole forest reserve set forth as a national forest outside of Yellowstone Park. Another big thing. His campaign, even before, his wife had been pretty ill. In fact, she had tuberculosis and she ended up dying of tuberculosis. So he didn't even go out and campaign. It might be why he, Grover Cleveland, when he ran against Grover Cleveland, Grover Cleveland ended up winning, because he basically didn't get to campaign much because he was taking care of his wife when she was ill. They called him Little Ben because he was short, 5'6". And again, he was the last Civil War general as president. And he was known by all of his opponents and those that liked him, his staff, but even his opponents thought he was very personable and had a personal and official integrity in his life. Benjamin Harrison. So he was the first president to have a Christmas tree in the White House. That's kind of fun. And first president to die in the 20th century. He died of the flu. And the first president to attend baseball games. Okay, what does he say here in the midst of all this? Let's read basically talking about the home, saying the home is the best, as it is the first school of citizenship. It is the great conservative assimilating force. I should despair for my country if American citizens were to be trained only in our schools. So what he was basically saying here is it's really important that young people, have integrity and get that for their home life. So he was into, families getting together and reading the Bible together. Harrison's administration. During Harrison's administration was the Sherman Silver Purchase Act. Congress to purchase more silver to increase silver in circulation. And so he was more of a gold person, but in the midst of this, the Band-Allison Act and the Silver Purchase Act. He increased the federal spending to develop rivers and harbors. We knew that. The Congress was first to appropriate funds to the billion-dollar country. In the midst of his collecting tariffs, our country basically became a billion-dollar country. The Oklahoma Territory was opened. 6 states became states, but the Oklahoma Territory was opened during this time. A lot of things happened during his short administration, 4 years. He had that protective tariff, and he put forth a 2-ocean Navy. 2-ocean Navy means the Navy would be on the Atlantic Ocean and the Navy would be on the Pacific Ocean. So he built up our Navy. So did Chet Arthur before him. So his Speaker of the House was Thomas Reed. They called him Czar Reed, and he was another one from Maine. And he actually would refuse the Democrats when the Democrats were refusing to answer the roll call, he would basically count them anyway present. So in the midst of this, he had a strong Speaker of the House in the Harrison administration. So Grover Cleveland would become the 24th president after Harrison. So Grover Cleveland was the 22nd, Harrison was the 23rd, and then back to Grover Cleveland in 1893 to 1897. So he ran against Republican President Harrison, and he was the former president, Grover Cleveland. So you have two presidents running against each other. Also, the Populist Party under James Weaver ran, and that kind of made a difference because James Weaver would kind of split the party of Republicans there too. So Cleveland won by a good margin, and he was the only president to serve in 2 non-consecutive terms. Now the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress, and Cleveland, here I have something, Cleveland's secret disease and surgery. Well, first of all, let's go over who's on the $1,000 bill. Grover Cleveland, right? And so Grover Cleveland did the most vetoes. We already went over that. Here's a picture that they had about his family saying, oh, he has an illegitimate son or whatever there in that picture. But one thing, I just found this out. I was researching him, and he actually had this, they said, secret disease and surgery. So he kept this secret. So he found out that he had, because he smoked so many cigars, he ended up cancer. He had cancer in his mouth and his palate and such. And so he would have to actually have this tumor removed from the top of, from his top palate of your mouth, his jaw. And so he didn't want the public to know. And of course, the Democrats didn't want anybody to know either, thinking that he was going to die, or which he could have because he had diagnosed of cancer. So we'd have to have surgery. So they kept it all quiet, and he ended up having surgery on a yacht. So he had this big yacht, and he brought it to the New York, harbor. Outside of New York Harbor, this yacht stood, and then he brought in all these, doctors and dentists or whatever, brought him in and had the surgery, tumor removed 5 of his teeth, and he was sick for a while, going back as president, and everybody just said, oh, he's had this really bad toothache. Nobody knew that he had major surgery. That he ended up having part of his palate, they had to put a rubber palate back in there. He ended up being okay speaking and stuff, but what happened, the bad part, is what happened was this journalist found out from one of the doctors what had happened, so published it about what had happened to him with this having surgery on this yacht, and published all the details. And Grover Cleveland and his Democratic Party, they all said it was a big lie and that this had not happened. And they really, they really drove the journalist into the ground, basically saying this journalist was a liar and all. And really, that took it hard on his life because nobody else would ever hire him, thinking that he lied about this whole thing about the president. Well, later on, time goes by. The journalist ends up being a journalist. I can't think of his name right now, but for New York Times, or not the New York Times, with Wall Street Journal or whatever. But one of the doctors, a few of the doctors that were involved, basically stood up and said later on, after Grover Cleveland had passed away, said that this journalist did, and this did happen. And that's pretty ugly, isn't it? That they would go ahead and lie to the public like that, and really put a journalist's life, in a big lie, So I'm not really wild about Grover Cleveland at all. I think that he wasn't really one for women's rights at all. He never stood for women at all. He marries a 21-year-old that's that was a daughter of his partner and such. There's just a lot of discrepancies about his life. But in the long term of what happened, there were some good things that came from it. But anyway, like I said, he's not one of my favorite. Cleveland's second administration, there was a panic. So his second administration was not a good one. There was a panic of 1893, and it led to a depression which lasted during his terms. So he became top favorite to not a favorite. But you see, went from hero to zero. Cleveland believed in the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and he believed in it in the beginning, but then he believed that the Sherman Silver Act may have been what caused the Depression, which it could have, because they put more silver into basically during Harrison's time into circulation, which may have caused the panic. Yeah, it could have. But this split his party support. Some of them believed silver was very important, and others believed gold. We find that an issue coming in the future. But what Cleveland did is he went out and sought the help of J.P. Morgan to sell government bonds and to loan him money for the government. What happens when you go to a banking system out, that's outside of the government? They end up helping you at very high interest rates. J.P. Morgan, to me, was pretty corrupt. He was involved in with the Rothschilds in Europe, in England at that point, and they would take any opportunity to make money on the government. So, but anyway, he sought help of J.P. Morgan. This led a lot of people to think he was corrupt because J.P. Morgan was involved with the big businesses of Rockefeller and all those. And he had allegiance with big businesses then, and this alienated many citizens from him. So, and the panic had happened, you'd see how unemployment increased during this time from 1890, but see how it's low, then during his time, the unemployment went up. So this panic was nationwide. Economic problems took center stage in America in 1893. The railroads went bankrupt, the stock market lost value, 15,000 businesses and 500 banks collapse. It's terrible when banks collapse because you could run and get your money out of the bank, and the bank collapse, you don't get your money. So it was a panic, that's for sure. 3 million people lost their jobs, putting unemployment at 20%. So not a good time for President Grover Cleveland, his second term. So the election of 1896 was with Bryan and McKinley. So Grover Cleveland would not run here. William Jennings Bryan would run for the Democrats, and then McKinley would run for president. So let's talk about William Jennings Bryan first. He favored the unlimited coinage of silver. So he was against the gold standard. In fact, he wrote a speech called Cross of Gold that was against that. Because I really didn't like taking the cross and putting it on a gold like that, the whole thing. I really didn't care for his speech. Although Bryan was a dynamic speaker, he was outspoken Presbyterian layman, so he's almost like a preacher. In fact, later on, he does stand against evolution in the school in the Scopes trial. So he was born again guy. I just didn't like some of the things he stood for in the Democratic Party at that time. So he would run for president 3 times, but each time he was actually a person to run for president more times and lose more times than any other, because he lost all 3 times. He was young when he ran against President McKinley. And he lived 1860 to 1925. He was a fearless defender of the causes that he thought were just. And he supported the farmers. He actually was representing from Lincoln, Nebraska. So he lived in Lincoln, Nebraska. He said, "Burn down your cities and leave your farms, and cities will spring up again like magic. But destroy the farms and the grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country." He's saying we need to support our farmers. So a lot of farmers loved William Jennings Bryan. So, and a lot called him a populist because of that. So Bryan traveled and he appealed to a lot of people. He was very personable, he was very likable, and he had Christian faith. Some pictures of him in the midst. You see, here's the chickens and stuff. He's supporting he's crown of thorns. Anyway, supporting the farmers. President William McKinley became president 1897 to 1901. He was the 25th president. He ran against William and Bryan, but McKinley became president. The reason McKinley became president because he didn't stand on silver. He stood on gold, that the gold, that money should be backed by gold. And he was for protective tariffs. And that was really important because at the time the Democrats did not have protective tariff, and that would cause a lot of panics, So McKinley did a front porch campaign. His wife was very ill. He was tending to his invalid wife. She had actually lost a baby. She lost a baby girl, and then her 3-year-old little girl got dysentery, I think, or typhoid fever, and died. And so she was an invalid, but not that. She was also epileptic. So he took care of her. So he did what calls a front porch campaign, as people came to his place to watch it, to listen to him speak. So he had the Gold Standard Act of 1900. And he actually went forth for the unions in the midst for certain trusts as long as interstate trade. So he made a deal with the companies for labor unions and such. And also, well, when I say trusts, this has to do with the improved labor relations, meeting with Samuel Gompers, president of the AFL. So he was into meeting with the labor unions, but also certain trusts. The trusts were the big business, and so he got together with a certain trust and has some interstate trade. And these were all actually positive things during his time. And we're going to go in the next video and talk more about him. So here we have. He ran in 1896 against William Jennings Bryan, the working class farmers, free silver, labor and reform, the cross of gold speeches under Bryan. And he was for a raised tariff, more tariffs to support our businesses, and a stronger gold standard, and a full dinner pail, saying basically we'll prosper. And we did prosper during him being president, but President McKinley, his second term, he wins again against William Jennings Bryan, right? But right afterwards, in 1900, he defeated Bryan and became president. In 1901, he was assassinated by an anarchist, Leon Czolgosz. I think that's how you pronounce it, Czolgosz. I'll find out next time, but I think that's how you, it's a Polish name. And it was at the Pan American Expo in Buffalo, New York, and he was shot on September 6th, and he died on September 14th of a wound infection, kind of like Garfield. Basically, in those times, when they tried to get in and get the bullets out and everything, a lot of infection would happen because they didn't use, antiseptics at all, or they didn't use sterile technique, I should say. So, and before he died, he actually forgave his assassin. So he was a Methodist. I believe he was a Christian. I'm not sure of that, but I think that he was. So we have his running mate. His vice president was Theodore Roosevelt. And so Teddy Roosevelt would become president, as he was his vice president. So here we have basically the issues here. McKinley was right, and now he was elected president, but he was actually, the president is dead. And here's a picture of him being assassinated, and this is Leon Czolgosz right here, his assassin. And we'll go on to the next video because we're going to talk a little bit more from the 1900, from President McKinley. When Teddy Roosevelt takes over, we'll have a new era of presidents. Okay, that's it.